Some invitations are not meant to be accepted. When a mother receives a dinner invitation from her own daughter, she expects warmth, reconciliation, family. What she doesn't expect is fear. Because just seconds before stepping inside that house, someone who had nothing to gain risked everything to warn her. That warning stopped a plan already in motion. A plan hidden behind concern, paperwork, and quiet preparation. I'm attorney Claire Morgan, and this case still unsettles me, not because of what happened in court, but because of how close one woman came to never telling her story at all. Her name was Margaret Hale. She was 62 years old when she came to my office. A retired school teacher, widowed, a woman who had spent her life protecting others without ever imagining she would need protection from her own child. Margaret raised her daughter, Isabel, alone after her husband's sudden death. She worked double shifts, skipped vacations, put her own life on hold so her daughter could have everything. And by every measure that society respects, Isabel turned out successful, married into a wealthy family, living in a large, elegant house, surrounded by staff. From the outside, it looked like a mother's sacrifice had paid off. So when Isabel called and invited her mother to a private dinner, just the two of them, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. She thought it was reconciliation. A chance to feel close again after months of emotional distance. She dressed carefully that evening, wore the necklace Isabel had given her years ago, even brought a small gift, something mothers do even when they shouldn't have to. When Margaret arrived at the house, everything looked perfect. The lights were warm, the table was already set, the air smelled of expensive food, nothing looked wrong, and that's what made the next moment so terrifying. As Margaret stepped inside, the housemaid, a woman who had worked there for years, froze when she saw her. Her face drained of color, her hands trembled. Margaret noticed something most people would have missed: fear, not the kind that startles. The kind that warns. The maid moved quickly, quietly. She leaned close, too close for comfort, and in a voice barely louder than breath, she said something that would later become evidence in court, words that stopped Margaret mid-step. Words that made her heart pound in her ears, words that saved her life. Margaret didn't understand why at first, but instinct, the same instinct that helps mothers sense danger, told her one thing: this was not a dinner. This was a setup. Margaret turned around without explanation, without confrontation, without alerting anyone inside. She walked away from her daughter's house, confused, shaken, and humiliated. That night she didn't sleep. By morning, she began to notice things she had ignored for months. Unanswered calls, sudden financial questions from her daughter, documents Isabel had pushed her to sign but never explained clearly. Margaret started checking her paperwork, and that's when she saw it. Her will, her property records, insurance beneficiaries quietly changed. Everything pointed to one conclusion: that dinner wasn't about family, it was about timing. Margaret didn't come to me asking for revenge. She came because she realized something horrifying. If she hadn't listened to that warning, there would be no one left to tell the truth. And as I reviewed her documents, one fact became painfully clear. This case wasn't just about betrayal. It was about planning, premeditation, and a mistake her daughter never expected. Someone inside the house had a conscience. When Evelyn Carter walked out of her daughter's house that night, she didn't yet understand the full weight of what had almost happened. She only knew one thing: something had gone terribly wrong in the place that was supposed to be safest. For the first time since becoming a mother, Evelyn did something that felt unnatural to her. She stopped protecting her child and started protecting herself. The following morning, Evelyn sat alone at her kitchen table with a stack of documents she hadn't reviewed in years. Papers she had trusted others to handle. Papers she had signed during moments of grief, illness, and emotional vulnerability, when she believed her daughter was acting in her best interest. What she found was not chaos. It was organization, and that frightened her more than any argument ever could. Her insurance policies had been consolidated. Her power of attorney had been modified. Certain assets had been simplified for convenience. Convenience for someone else. Everything was legal on the surface. Clean, polished, carefully timed. The kind of paperwork that doesn't scream fraud but whispers intent. Evelyn began replaying the past 2 years in her mind. Sophia insisting on helping with finances. Sophia discouraging her from talking to old friends. Sophia suggesting Evelyn move closer. Sophia framing every decision as concern. concern that slowly isolated her. What looked like care was actually control. Evelyn realized something most victims realize far too late. Nothing had been rushed. This plan had been built patiently. She also realized why the dinner invitation had felt sudden. Everything else was already in place. By the time Evelyn came to me, she wasn't asking questions anymore. She was bringing confirmation. As I reviewed her documents, a pattern emerged. Small changes spread out over time designed to avoid suspicion. Witnesses positioned carefully, medical records referenced indirectly. It wasn't impulsive, it was strategic. And then there was the maid, the woman whose fear had interrupted the plan. Evelyn hadn't spoken to her again, but she didn't need to. The maid's reaction told us more than words ever could. People who live inside houses like that see everything. They hear late-night conversations, they clean up after private meetings. They notice when schedules change for no obvious reason, and they recognize danger when it walks through the door. What Sophia failed to understand was that silence does not mean loyalty. As we continued digging, something even more disturbing surfaced. A recent medical consultation arranged by Sophia had been documented inaccurately, symptoms exaggerated, language softened in places it shouldn't have been. A narrative quietly forming. Evelyn was being positioned, not as a mother, not as a respected elder, but as someone whose decisions could be questioned. Someone whose independence could be legally challenged. Someone whose absence would be convenient. This wasn't about inheritance alone. It was about speed, about removing obstacles, and about ensuring that when questions were asked, the answers were already prepared. Evelyn sat across from me as I explained the risks. Not once did she interrupt, not once did she cry. Instead, she asked a question I will never forget, not about punishment, not about revenge, but about truth. She wanted to know whether the law could still protect her, even when the threat came from her own child. The answer was yes, but only because she had listened, only because she had walked away, only because someone inside that house had chosen humanity over obedience. From that moment forward, Evelyn's role changed. She was no longer a passive figure in someone else's plan. She became a witness. And witnesses change outcomes. What Sophia believed was a perfectly controlled situation had already begun to unravel, because control relies on one dangerous assumption that no one will speak, and in this case, someone already had. By the time Evelyn Carter officially placed her trust in me, one truth had already become unavoidable. This case was no longer about suspicion, it was about prevention. Because plans like the one forming around Evelyn do not pause on their own. They adapt. They evolve, and most dangerously, they accelerate once they sense resistance. The first step was to make Evelyn legally visible again. For months, possibly years, she had existed in a kind of administrative shadow, her identity reduced to signatures and approvals, her autonomy disguised as convenience. We reversed that, bank access restored, independent medical evaluations scheduled, financial oversight reestablished under her direct authority. Each action was small, but together they disrupted something far larger, a rhythm. A system that relied on Evelyn remaining predictable, and predictability once broken creates panic. Within days, subtle reactions began surfacing. Unreturned calls turned into sudden concern. Neutral messages shifted into urgency. Sophia's tone, once measured, grew tighter. Control does not like being questioned, but what mattered most wasn't how Sophia reacted. It was what the house began to reveal, because houses hold memories. They absorb conversations, they remember routines, they witness patterns no outsider ever sees, and inside that house there was someone who had been watching for far longer than anyone realized. The maid. For legal reasons, we proceeded carefully. Witnesses in situations like this are vulnerable. Their employment depends on silence. Their safety depends on discretion. But conscience has a way of surfacing when danger becomes real. Through indirect channels, we learned fragments, not statements, not accusations, observations, late-night visitors who were not family, documents discussed at the dining table, not the study. A pattern of special dinners that always followed major financial changes. Dinners that were never about food. One detail stood out. Evelyn was the first intended guest who didn't stay, and the only one who walked away. The maid had seen this before, not the same situation but the same preparation. She had recognized the signs because she had cleaned up after them, the polished table, the untouched plates. The forced atmosphere of intimacy designed to mask pressure. The house had hosted rehearsals. That realization shifted the case entirely. This wasn't a one-time impulse, it was a practice scenario. We began mapping timelines, asset transfers, medical appointments, family events. When aligned, they told a story that no single document could. Every major legal adjustment was preceded by a family moment. A visit, a dinner, a private conversation. Sophia wasn't careless, she was methodical. What she didn't anticipate was deviation. Evelyn's survival disrupted the sequence, and disrupted sequences leave traces. As we continued, another layer emerged: social isolation. Friends who hadn't heard from Evelyn in months. Missed gatherings explained away as fatigue. Stories told on Evelyn's behalf without her present. Someone had been curating a narrative in which Evelyn was becoming forgetful. Dependent, unstable, not enough to trigger alarm, just enough to justify intervention. The law is especially sensitive to these patterns because they don't announce themselves loudly. They blend into concern, into caregiving, into family responsibility, but once identified, they are unmistakable. Evelyn struggled with this part, not because she doubted the evidence, but because she doubted herself. Every memory became suspect, every kindness re-examined. That is the cruelest aftermath of betrayal. It doesn't just steal security, it steals certainty. We slowed the process deliberately. Protection orders drafted but not filed. Safeguards implemented quietly. Documentation preserved without alert, because confrontation at this stage would have been dangerous. Sophia still believed control could be regained, and people who believe that often escalate. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. A routine audit uncovered something that could not be explained away. A life insurance policy Evelyn did not remember approving, recently increased. Significantly, the timing was precise, weeks before the dinner. The policy alone wasn't illegal, but combined with everything else it became intent. Evelyn didn't react the way people expect. There was no shock, no disbelief, only a quiet understanding. The kind that comes when all the missing pieces finally lock into place. This wasn't about misunderstanding. It was about readiness. And the house, with its silent corridors and polished floors, had known the truth long before Evelyn did. What Sophia failed to realize was this: plans that rely on silence collapse the moment someone chooses to observe. And now the law was watching, carefully, patiently, waiting, because cases like this are not won through accusation. They are won through timing, and Sophia had already made her most critical mistake. She believed the danger had passed. It hadn't. It had only changed direction. The moment Evelyn Carter stopped behaving as expected, the atmosphere around her changed. Not abruptly, not dramatically. It changed the way weather does, quietly but with intent. People who build plans based on control rarely abandon them at the first sign of resistance. They test boundaries, they apply pressure, they look for weaknesses. Sophia began with what she knew best: concern, messages framed as worry. Sudden offers of help. Questions about Evelyn's health that felt less like care and more like inspection. To an outsider, it would have looked like a devoted daughter checking in. To the law, it looked like calibration. Sophia was trying to determine how much authority she still had. Evelyn, guided carefully, did not confront her. She didn't accuse. She didn't withdraw entirely. She responded politely, predictably, just enough to appear compliant. Because pressure tactics only escalate when they feel challenged. And escalation was exactly what we needed. Within weeks, the second phase began. Third parties appeared. A distant relative suddenly checking in. An old family friend asking unusual questions. A professional acquaintance suggesting planning for the future. None of them hostile, all of them aligned. It was a coordinated effort to reinforce a narrative that Evelyn was fragile, that she needed guidance, that decisions should be shared if not transferred entirely. This is how autonomy is dismantled legally, not with force, with consensus. But consensus only works when no one documents the pattern. We did. Every call logged, every visit noted, every suggestion recorded. Because in cases like this, repetition is evidence. The pressure intensified when Sophia realized Evelyn was no longer isolated. Friends began reappearing in her life. Appointments were attended alone, documents were reviewed independently. Control slipping often produces desperation, and desperation makes mistakes. The first mistake came through urgency. Sophia proposed another dinner. A smaller gathering, a calmer setting, a chance to clear misunderstandings. Timing matters in the law, and the timing was wrong, too soon, too eager. Sophia didn't realize how revealing that was. The second mistake came through overreach. An attempt to access records that were no longer hers to touch. A request framed as routine that triggered automatic alerts. Small miscalculations, but miscalculations nonetheless. Behind the scenes, we took measures Evelyn never saw. Safeguards layered quietly, legal guardianship protections preemptively blocked, insurance policies frozen pending review. We were no longer reacting. We were positioning. What Sophia didn't understand was that the law had already shifted perspective. This was no longer a family dispute. It was a vulnerability case, and vulnerability cases change how evidence is weighed. The maid's role grew clearer during this period, not as a witness yet, but as a presence. Her continued employment, her proximity, her silence. She had not spoken, but she had not recanted either. And silence, when sustained under pressure, becomes credibility. Evelyn struggled emotionally during this phase because pressure doesn't just target systems, it targets memory. She questioned herself constantly, wondered whether she was overreacting, whether love had been mistaken for manipulation, whether walking away that night had been an overinterpretation. That is exactly how pressure works. It doesn't need to prove innocence. It only needs to create doubt. The law does not operate on doubt, it operates on patterns, and the pattern was now undeniable. Sophia's actions were no longer defensive. They were corrective, designed to restore an outcome that had been interrupted. Which meant one thing: the plan was still active, just altered, and altered plans often grow more dangerous because they must account for resistance. The turning point came when Evelyn received a document she was never meant to question. A recommendation, polite, professional, urgent. It suggested reassessing her capacity out of an abundance of caution. The language was careful, but the intent was unmistakable. This was no longer about inheritance. It was about authority. If Evelyn could be declared unreliable, everything else would follow legally. That document never reached its destination. Because we intercepted it, and in doing so, we crossed a line Sophia could not uncross. From that moment forward, the case changed direction. No more observation, no more waiting. The pressure phase had revealed its purpose. And now the law was prepared to respond. Not loudly, not publicly, but decisively. Because once control transforms into coercion, the protection mechanisms activate. And the people who rely on silence discover something too late. The law has been listening the entire time. Up until this point, everything in Evelyn Carter's case had lived in the shadows. Patterns, intent, preparation. But no direct confrontation. That wasn't an accident. In cases involving family and control, exposure too early doesn't end the threat, it sharpens it. What we needed was not reaction. We needed confirmation. And confirmation, in cases like this, almost always comes from the place people assume will never speak. Inside the house. While pressure continued externally, something quieter was happening internally. The maid had started changing her routines, arriving earlier, leaving later, staying close when certain conversations occurred, not to interfere, to remember. Because people who witness danger often begin recording it in the only way they safely can. Mentally, every unusual request, every mention of timelines, every casual reference to what would happen if. When the law finally reached out indirectly, the response was not immediate. Fear rarely allows immediate courage. But silence stretched into something else. Resolve. The maid did not come forward as an accuser, she came forward as an observer, and that distinction matters. Her account did not include emotion. It did not include speculation. It included sequence, preparation of meals that were never eaten, medication discussions that didn't match prescriptions, conversations about making things easier soon, details small enough to be dismissed individually. Devastating when aligned. The most critical detail was not what was said, it was what was expected. Sophia had expected the dinner to conclude something, not begin it. The law began formalizing its position quietly. Not through accusations, through protection, temporary legal barriers placed around Evelyn's assets, independent evaluations scheduled through neutral parties, employment protections extended to potential witnesses. Sophia sensed the shift. Control systems are sensitive. They detect resistance the way pressure systems detect leaks. Her approach changed again, less warmth, more firmness. Concern gave way to entitlement. Evelyn was no longer being guided. She was being corrected. That correction created the final mistake, an attempt to formalize authority too quickly, a legal filing that assumed consent that had already been revoked. That filing did not proceed. But it left behind something invaluable, a timestamp, intent locked to action. In law, timing transforms suspicion into proof. At this stage, Evelyn was no longer at risk, but the case was. Because once exposure begins, the outcome depends on who controls the narrative. Sophia attempted to regain that control socially. Subtle explanations offered to extended family. Preemptive concern expressed about Evelyn's stress. Carefully placed doubts. It didn't work because Evelyn was no longer silent. She didn't accuse, she didn't defend. She simply existed publicly, clearly, and independently. That alone dismantled the constructed image. When people expected weakness and saw strength, the story collapsed. The Maid statement was formalized, still limited, still careful, but now documented. And documentation changes everything. The house that had hidden conversations had become a source of record. What Sophia believed was a closed environment was now permeable, watched, accounted for. The case was no longer about whether something might have happened. It was about whether it would have been allowed to finish. And the answer was no, because the law does not require tragedy to intervene. It only requires intent. And intent had finally stepped into the light. Up to this point, the law had moved carefully, quietly, precisely. Every safeguard placed around Evelyn Carter had been designed to protect without provoking. But there comes a moment in cases like this when caution must give way to clarity. That moment arrived not with confrontation but with procedure. A formal notice, neutral in tone, routine in appearance, but devastating in implication. Sophia was informed that certain actions she had initiated were now subject to review. No accusations, no conclusions, just oversight. And oversight is something control does not tolerate. The response was immediate. Legal counsel retained. Communications tightened. A visible shift from familial concern to defensive posture. That shift mattered, because in law, posture reveals intent. Sophia was no longer acting as a daughter managing care. She was acting as someone protecting exposure. The first official review centered on capacity, not because Evelyn was unfit, but because someone had implied she might be. Independent evaluations were conducted. Professionals with no prior connection, no emotional investment. The results were clear. Evelyn was competent, alert, fully capable of managing her affairs. That alone dismantled months of quiet narrative building, but more importantly, it created a record, one that could not be rewritten. The second review addressed financial activity. Every adjustment, every authorization, every convenience. Placed in sequence, the picture became unmistakable. Actions taken without informed consent. Decisions framed as temporary that were, in fact, permanent. Benefits flowing in only one direction. Still, none of it was explosive, because this case wasn't about shock. It was about inevitability. Sophia began pushing back harder. Requests for access, challenges to oversight, attempts to accelerate timelines. Acceleration is the final phase of failing control, and it almost always precedes collapse. Behind the scenes, witness protections were quietly activated. The maid's position was stabilized. Her role, though limited, was acknowledged, not as an accuser, as a corroborator. She confirmed routines, sequences, patterns. She never claimed intent. She didn't need to. The law draws intent from behavior. As pressure mounted, Sophia made her most consequential decision. She attempted to formalize authority through legal channels again. But this time, without plausible deniability, documents were filed that assumed Evelyn's compliance that no longer existed. Those filings triggered a response far beyond what Sophia anticipated. Because now the question was no longer whether control had been attempted. It was whether coercion had occurred, and coercion changes everything. The case was elevated, not publicly, procedurally, additional scrutiny, expanded scope. Deeper examination of motive. At this stage, Evelyn was asked a question no parent ever expects to answer, not about punishment, about boundaries. She was asked whether she wished to proceed, whether she wanted the law to continue pulling the thread. Because once pulled, there is no return to normal. Evelyn did not hesitate. She understood something clearly now. This wasn't about her relationship with her daughter. That relationship had already been compromised. This was about preventing harm to herself and to anyone else who might one day be placed in the same position. The law moved forward, carefully, relentlessly. And with each step, Sophia's position weakened. The image of control she had curated began to fracture under scrutiny. The dinner, the documents, the timing, what once appeared disconnected now formed a coherent narrative. Not one of misunderstanding, but of preparation. By the end of this phase, one truth was unavoidable. If Evelyn had entered that house that night, this case would not exist. And that realization changed how every action before and after was interpreted. The law had finally stepped into the room, and it was not leaving. Once the law fully entered the picture, time stopped working in Sophia's favor. Every system she had relied on, silence, patience, familiarity, began to fail her. Control requires belief. Belief that authority will not be questioned. Belief that concern will not be challenged. Belief that family loyalty will override doubt. But the moment those beliefs fracture, control becomes exposure. The first fracture appeared socially. Conversations Sophia thought were private began echoing back in unexpected ways. Extended family members grew cautious. Professional contacts hesitated, not because accusations had been made, but because uncertainty had replaced confidence. In situations like this, people distance themselves not from guilt, but from risk. The second fracture was procedural. Reviews expanded beyond what Sophia had anticipated. Not outwardly dramatic, just thorough. Past transactions revisited, communications re-examined, timelines aligned with intent. Every attempt to explain began sounding rehearsed, and rehearsed explanations attract scrutiny. Sophia tried to regain footing by reframing the narrative. She emphasized stress, misunderstanding, overreaction. But those explanations collided with documented consistency. Evelyn had not reacted emotionally, she had responded systematically. That distinction mattered. The law trusts systems over stories, and the system showed intent. The maid's role became impossible to ignore, not because she accused, but because she corroborated. Her presence inside the house placed context around actions Sophia claimed were isolated, meals prepared with specific timing, conversations held repeatedly around legal milestones, references to outcomes that assumed inevitability. The house that once protected secrecy now amplified evidence. The most telling moment came when Sophia was presented with a choice. Not a verdict, a decision. She was offered the opportunity to step back, to relinquish authority quietly, to preserve some version of relationship. It was not a punishment. It was an exit, and she refused. That refusal was revealing. Because people who act out of care accept boundaries. People who act out of control challenge them. Sophia challenged them. Her resistance hardened, her language sharpened, concern disappeared entirely. What remained was entitlement. And entitlement is never a legal defense. At this stage, the case shifted from protective to corrective, not because of emotion, but because of risk. Safeguards became enforceable measures. Oversight became restriction. Access became conditional. Evelyn watched this unfold with a kind of grief that cannot be articulated, not because she doubted the process, but because she understood the cost. There would be no return to innocence. No version of the story where love alone explained what had happened. But clarity is often kinder than denial. As the final reviews concluded, one conclusion stood above all others. This was not a misunderstanding between parent and child. It was a structured attempt to assume control over another adult's life, and structure implies intention. Sophia's last attempt to salvage the situation came through emotion. Not tears, anger framed as betrayal, anger directed at Evelyn for overreacting. But anger does not undo records, it does not erase timelines, and it does not silence witnesses. By the end of this phase, the outcome was no longer in question, only the form it would take. The law does not rush judgment, but it does not forget patterns either. Sophia had believed her greatest advantage was closeness, that no one would suspect a daughter. That assumption had been wrong, because the law does not see family, it sees behavior, and the behavior had finally spoken clearly enough to be heard. Cases like Evelyn Carter's rarely end with a dramatic moment. No raised voices, no public spectacle. They end quietly with boundaries drawn, authority restored, and damage contained before it becomes irreversible. That in itself is a kind of justice. By the time the proceedings reached their conclusion, the question was no longer what might have happened. It was what had already been prevented. The law did not punish suspicion, it addressed conduct. Evelyn's autonomy was formally reaffirmed. Her assets were secured under her sole authority. All prior attempts to redirect control were nullified. Safeguards were made permanent, not because Evelyn was weak but because she had been targeted. Sophia did not face public condemnation. The law does not require spectacle to be effective. Instead, she lost what she had tried to claim: control, access, authority, influence. Every channel she had quietly relied on was closed. Not as revenge, as consequence. The maid's role was acknowledged carefully and respectfully. Her courage did not turn her into a symbol. It turned her into proof. Proof that awareness can interrupt harm. Proof that conscience still matters. Proof that silence is not the same as consent. Evelyn never returned to that house. She didn't need to. The place where danger nearly disguised itself as family no longer held power over her. In the months that followed, Evelyn rebuilt something she hadn't realized she had lost: trust in her own judgment. She reconnected with friends, resumed routines without permission, lived without explanation, not defiantly, peacefully. People often ask me how cases like this feel in the end, whether there is relief, whether there is closure. The truth is more complicated. Evelyn didn't leave this case with joy, she left with clarity. She understood that love does not require surrender, that family does not excuse control, that survival does not always look like escape. Sometimes it looks like listening to a warning and walking away. That dinner never happened. And because it didn't, a life continued. This case serves as a reminder of something the law sees often, but society rarely talks about. Danger does not always arrive loudly. It sometimes arrives with invitations. And sometimes the difference between harm and survival is a single voice willing to say, "Leave now."